Hello again, I'm Matthew Gore from lightandmatter.org, and I'm back this time with my comparison of Tamron's 24-70 f2.8 VC USD G2 with Canon's 24-70 f2.8L Mark II. These are both really excellent lenses, but there are some significant differences. The Tamron includes image stabilization and costs about $1,200. The Canon, of course, is not stabilized, and now costs around $1,700. This is the first in a series of videos. Over the winter, I shot with the Canon f2.8, the Tamron G2, the Sigma Art Series lens, and also the Canon f4 IS, just to see how they all compare. If you'd like to see all these videos, this is a good time to subscribe to my channel, and of course, I always appreciate a like now and then too. Better yet, you can now join my army of Patreon supporters and help me make more videos like this. My Patreon subscribers also get to decide which video I make next, either the Canon versus the Sigma or the Tamron versus the Sigma. But back to the lenses. Both lenses are solidly built, but the Tamron is a little heavier. The Canon weighs in at about 1 3/4 pounds, while the Tamron is about 2. And even though they're about the same width at their widest points, the Tamron is a little wider overall. Otherwise, they're very similar. They both have 82mm filter threads, weather sealing, and their maximum magnification is right around 1:5, with the Canon holding a slight edge. The position of the focus and zoom rings are switched between the two, and also the direction of the zoom rings. On the Canon, you'll turn the ring clockwise to zoom in, and on the Tamron, you'll turn it counterclockwise, just as you would on the Sony G Master or most Nikon lenses. That takes some getting used to for most Canon shooters. As usual, I shot with these lenses around the Seattle area, but also in New York City this time, at least with the Tamron and the Canon f4. This time I shot all of the resolution test shots with a Canon 5DS-R, but otherwise used the same procedure as my previous videos. Shooting from a tripod with the mirror up and stabilization off, I focused with live view, used a remote release, processed the files as 16-bit RAW, with no extra sharpening or lens correction in Adobe Camera Raw. If you'd like to take a look at some of the RAW files yourself, you can download a group of them here, or by following the link in the description below. So let's begin by taking a look at the image quality at the wide end of the zoom range. Wide open here in the center, first we notice some pretty obvious moire in the fine lines on the side of this building, since the 5DS-R doesn't have a low-pass filter. The fact that it's worse on the Canon side is a good indicator that the Canon is resolving more detail, and you can see the difference if you look at the fine lines there. The Tamron is nice and sharp too, but not quite on par. As we move away from the center, the difference becomes more apparent. Take a look at the text on this BMW sign. Out at the edge of the frame, the image quality is suffering with both lenses, but the Tamron is getting noticeably blurry. It's easy to see in the details of the container cranes on the waterfront here. Interestingly, when we look at the opposite corner, the Tamron doesn't look so much worse than the Canon to me. Stopping down to f4, things don't look a whole lot different in the center. They're both still nice and sharp, but the Canon is resolving more detail, which is still apparent in the moire. Moving away from the center, the Tamron is catching up, but the Canon is still a bit sharper and more contrasty, but the difference is almost gone, and would probably be imperceptible on a lower resolution sensor. At the edge here, the Canon is a bit sharper than before, but the Tamron is still disappointingly blurry. Stopping down to f5.6, things still look the same in the center, with the Canon a bit sharper, but they're very close. Moving away from the center a bit, they're almost identical, but I think I can see an antenna up here on the Canon that isn't there on the Tamron side. Out at the left center edge, the Canon is still much sharper than the Tamron, but on the right side, there's no significant difference at all. Stop down to f8, the difference away from the center here is gone, and I can see the fine antenna through both lenses, though it looks like they didn't survive the video compression. On the edge of the frame, there's still not much difference. Looking at the detail on the top of this building, there's a little more you can see on the Canon side, but it's a judgment call. There's nothing you'd even see in a print. However, there is still a significant difference out on the left edge. When we zoom into 70mm though, the tables turn a little bit. Wide open, the Tamron looks a hair sharper here in the center, looking at these tree branches, and maybe this fire escape back here, but they're very similar. This isn't a difference you'd notice in a print. Moving away from the center, the Canon is clearly more contrasty, and we're getting a little more detail here too. The difference is easy to see when looking at this courtyard sign. Really, it's impressive that I can see this sign at all, considering that I was shooting with a 70mm lens from about 2 miles away. Near the edge of the frame, they're both a little soft, and again, they're almost identical, but the Canon is a bit sharper. At f4, I don't see any difference in the center, even in the fine details. If one is measurably sharper than the other, it's not relevant for real-world use. Over here, looking at I-5 during one of the rare moments when it isn't completely clogged with traffic, I'd say that if anything, the Tamron is slightly sharper, but for all practical purposes, they're identical. At the edge, both lenses have some trouble with magenta fringing along the outer edge of this building, but it's worse on the Canon side. Otherwise, there just isn't much difference. At 5.6, things start to get interesting. In the center, they're still the same. Over here at the freeway, if anything, the Tamron looks a little sharper, particularly looking at this crane. If you try to read the freeway signs, you'll notice that the Canon produces a larger image, so the Tamron may be closer to a 67 or 68mm. That's common with zoom lenses. At the top of the frame, in Photoshop, the Tamron looks just a bit sharper, but here in the video, they look about the same. Out at the left side, the Tamron is noticeably sharper when you look at the key bank sign and the text on these signs by the yellow car. At f8, the Tamron is just a little bit sharper here. Still easiest to see in these signs. And back up at the top of these towers, they're really close. I'd say that they're identical, except that the Canon has more contrast. Also, this railing along the roofline is much easier to see on the Canon side, but I don't know whether that's because of a difference in lighting or not. Here at the other edge, the Tamron looks sharper again, though it's still very close. I can see more detail in this tree, and also in some of the rooftop detail here. So it seems that while the Canon is generally better at the wide end, at the 70mm end, the Tamron is just as good, or maybe better when stopped down. Let's take a look at another example. For this set, I drove up the Mountain Loop Highway again. At 24mm wide open, the difference in the center is visible, but the difference is primarily in contrast. They're both capturing a lot of detail, but the edges are sharper on the Canon side, and the Tamron looks a little hazy. There's a ton of detail on both sides though. The same thing is true away from the center here a little. The Canon is still more contrasty and is capturing a little more detail, but it's a pretty modest difference, considering that this is zoomed in all the way on a 50 megapixel image. Looking up at the snow-covered trees in the corner, it's pretty clear that the Canon is sharper and capturing more detail all around. It's especially apparent in the trees at the bottom of the frame. At f4, the Tamron has gained a lot of contrast in the center, and now they're virtually indistinguishable. If you shoot with a 5D Mark IV or any lower resolution camera, these will certainly look identical. Away from the center a bit, the difference remains pretty unremarkable, but I think the Canon retains slightly better contrast, though it's possible that what we're seeing here is a difference in lighting. Either way, they're both excellent. Up here in the corner again, the Tamron has really caught up. Where there was a pretty significant difference at f2.8, the Canon is only slightly sharper here at f4, though it is a visible difference. This probably isn't the kind of difference you'd notice in a print, and of course, you'd never notice it on the internet, even on a 4K monitor if you're looking at the whole image. At f5.6, for some reason, the Tamron looks a little soft in parts of the center. Probably because of a gust of wind on these cedar branches, where the Canon is so sharp in comparison. Overall, though, they're still about identical, though I think the Canon still has an edge in contrast. Away from the center, there's really no significant difference here. Certainly, any adjustments in contrast or sharpening in Photoshop would be more important than lens choice here. Up here near the corner, things are pretty even again. And just for consistency, looking down at the bottom left corner, again, they both look really great. The colors are slightly different, but this is something that you can profile out of your workflow with a color checker and a custom camera and lens profile. And even though it's pretty much academic at this point, here's what they look like at f8 out here. Again, no significant differences. Taking a look in the right corner trees, they both look great. The Tamron is nice and contrasty here now. And the same thing is true down here in the bottom right. No obvious differences. Now, if we zoom into the 70mm end and take a look, right from the get-go, they're both really nice and contrasty. I would say that they look identical here, but looking at this little forked twig, it's just a hair sharper on the Canon side. And I guess I'd say the same thing all around. The edges are just a hair crisper through the Canon at 50 megapixels. Away from the center a bit, I don't really see any significant difference. There's a little room for improvement on both sides. The Canon might have more contrast, but it's too close to matter. Out at the edge of the frame, the Tamron is actually noticeably sharper than the Canon. In some of these branches, the Canon side looks a little soft, and we're getting a little more detail in the bark of these trees in the background on the Tamron side. Stopping down to f4, not much has changed in the center. The Canon is still a bit more contrasty, slightly sharper, but they're both excellent. In fact, let me just point this out. This little branch detail that I'm looking at here is just a tiny detail that's so small that it's invisible here at 1080p resolution. Anyway, down here along the river shore, the Canon is a little sharper when looking at the texture of the gravel between the rocks, but they're still nearly identical. We do see a significant amount of cyan green fringing on the rocks down here on both lenses, and cyan and magenta up here on this patch of snow. I'd say this chromatic aberration is a little worse on the Tamron, but it's a problem on both sides. Luckily, that's pretty easy to fix in post-processing. Up in the top corner, I wouldn't say that either one of them is super sharp, and again, they're pretty close. Maybe the Canon has the edge. Stopping down to f5.6, any significant difference that was visible at f4 is gone now in the center. They both look great. Out here, again, they're identical. Some details appear sharper on the Tamron side, maybe some sharper on the Canon, so I'd call it a toss-up. Up closer to the corner here, the Tamron is still slightly sharper than the Canon, but the difference is getting to be pretty insignificant, probably invisible even at 24 megapixels. On the opposite corner though, the Canon is sharper, with some of the fine details on the Tamron side looking a little streaky, almost like motion blur. Normally I'd say that this would be the result of decentering of the optics, or another alignment problem, but as we've seen in these images, these variations are not consistent, which leads me to believe that we're seeing the effects of an image stabilization element failing to return to perfect alignment when the stabilization is switched off. Unfortunately, I didn't recognize this as a possibility at the time and make further tests, and I have sent this G2 back to Tamron already. So this is something I'll have to keep an eye out for in future tests. Regardless, in this case, the difference is pretty modest, and stopping down to f8 makes them more similar, although the advantage on the Canon side doesn't disappear completely. In the upper corner, though, I'd say that there's no significant difference in resolution, though we do see a little more color fringing up here. And here on the other side of the frame, the Tamron is just slightly sharper, but they're virtually identical. With that in mind, I would summarize the resolution and sharpness of these lenses like this. At the wide end, the Canon is a little sharper all around, but particularly towards the edges at f2.8 and f4. By f5.6, the differences are pretty modest, except where we saw some fall off on the left side with the Tamron in a couple of instances. At the 70mm end, the Canon was sometimes slightly sharper in the center at f2.8 and f4, but the Tamron was generally sharper at the borders of the frame at those apertures, and also sometimes in the center. By f5.6, they're identical for all practical purposes, though there may be slight variations around the frame. More generally, at the apertures that you'd typically use as a landscape photographer from a tripod, the lenses are both wonderfully sharp, and virtually identical. So let's move on to what is more typical, real-world shooting for most of us. I shot these images with the Tamron G2 lens to test out the general handling and image stabilization in New York City and around Seattle. Most of these shots were shot with my Canon 5D Mark III. I had no problems with autofocus speed or autofocus accuracy, and the images were wonderfully sharp, even at slow shutter speeds, and with strong backlight. What's really worth looking at here is how the Tamron with its image stabilization compares to the Canon without. Take a look at this shot from the Tamron with stabilization on at a 1/13 of a second. It's handheld, but really pretty sharp for such a slow shutter speed, even if you look at this fine text on the door. And here's what that looks like with the Canon lens with no stabilization. This is so blurry that it's not really usable even at web resolution. I took several shots like these, all handheld, looking at this bookstore window, shot at a 1/15 of a second at 70mm. They're actually both okay when you view them at a small enough size, but enlarge them a bit, and it becomes very clear how much difference that image stabilization makes. The small text on this Kurt Vonnegut book becomes just a suggestion of text on the Canon side, while it's still basically legible with the Tamron. So if you're a travel photographer or event photographer that frequently works in low light, the image stabilization of the Tamron lens is likely to make a much bigger impact on the clarity of your images than the tiny difference in resolution. That's worth keeping in mind. And finally, we get to the lens's autofocus and focus tracking performance. I shot several children's basketball games with these lenses. Both of these lenses did pretty well when it came to focusing and shooting single shots. These were all shot with the Tamron, and they're all just fine. All of these show the softness associated with an ISO of 12,800 or 6,400, but focus was no problem, whether the players were far or close or running or stopping or whatever. But there was a problem. When I was shooting long bursts of a player running towards me, and that player suddenly stopped or changed direction, I'd sometimes lose focus with the Tamron. Here, the player is running along, and then pulls up to make a pass, and I lose focus. The actual focus would continue to travel towards me, as if the predictive autofocus expected the player to continue along the same path, and I'd end up with the next few shots being completely blurry, with the focus way in front of the subject. The first time I thought it was just a fluke. No autofocus system is perfect, but it kept happening. Certainly not every time, but often enough to be a concern. Now, you might think that this is just a difficult situation for a camera to handle, and this sort of thing would happen with any lens, but when I shot with the Canon lenses, both the f2.8 and the f4, it didn't happen. In all of the games that I've shot with my Canon lenses, I've only seen this phenomenon once, which you can see here. But the lens quickly readjusts and pulls focus again, although it then misses the second shot. With the Canon, problems with back focusing were more common. Here I'm focusing on number 24 in white, but the focal plane is consistently on number 22 behind her. In fact, it was consistent enough that I wondered whether I had accidentally been using a focusing point on the right instead of in the center, so I pulled up the metadata to check, and sure enough, you can see that the center autofocus point was being used. But that was relatively rare with the Canon. And just so we're clear here, when shooting with the Tamron, most of the time the autofocus was just fine while I was shooting bursts like these, especially when the light was decent. It was just a frequent enough problem to be worth mentioning. So, to sum up, both lenses focus quickly and accurately for general sports and action photography. With my camera though, the Tamron had problems tracking a subject moving towards me, but only while shooting long bursts of images. If I were just looking through the viewfinder, tracking was solid. It didn't happen every time, but it was often enough to be a problem if that is your shooting style. The Canon was more likely to have problems with back focus during bursts of shots, but when focus was lost badly, it recovered more quickly than the Tamron. I'd guess that the Tamron's problem has to do with the predictive autofocus algorithm, which could potentially be fixed with a firmware update. Still, while I'd recommend the lens for casual action photographers and most event photographers, I would not recommend it for those who shoot sports primarily, at least not until they've confirmed that this isn't a problem with their camera model and lens combination. I've only tested it with the 5D Mark III, and for all I know, the 5D Mark IV might not have the problem, but this might be a good situation to rent before you buy. And before I wrap up this video, let's take a quick look at the vignetting. As you can see here, when shooting at the 70mm end, neither has a problem until you get down to f4, where it starts to show up a little bit in the corners of the Tamron, and they both have some at f2.8. Here, there's a little bit more on the Tamron, but in general, the vignetting is very similar between the two lenses. The Canon had a little bit less at the 70mm end, but the Tamron was a little better at the 24mm end. The differences were minimal though, about a half a stop in the corners at most, not a big deal. So where does that leave us? Pretty much in the same place as when I compared the first version of this Tamron lens with the Canon Mark II lens. When it comes to build quality, they're both nice sturdy lenses with weather sealing. I think the G2 is an improvement over the original Tamron. The Tamron is a little bigger and heavier than the Canon, as you'd expect from a stabilized lens. When it comes to resolution and sharpness, the Canon is a little better at the wide end, and they're about equal at the 70mm end, with the Canon being sharper in the center and the Tamron a little better towards the borders. I'd give the Canon the edge when it comes to autofocus performance, though it is a bit of a mixed bag and can depend on your camera body, and this could change with firmware updates. The Tamron has a pretty big advantage in being stabilized. Vignetting is a toss-up, with the Canon a little better at the 70mm end and the Tamron a little better at the 24mm end. And of course, the Tamron is the less expensive lens. The Canon costs about $1,700 and the Tamron costs about $1,200 today. And I think it's worth repeating this bit from my first lens comparison video. I think it's worth remembering that sharpness is almost never what makes a photograph great. When's the last time you were in a gallery and heard someone say, "I love this picture"? Really? Why? Well, it's so sharp, even in the corners. No, a great image comes from great composition, catching a great moment, or from a great idea. Ultimately, the right lens for you will depend on what you're going to be shooting. For many photographers, the huge advantage of image stabilization will outweigh the minor differences in resolution. However, if you're primarily a sports photographer, you'll want to check out the autofocus performance on your camera body before you commit to the Tamron. And that's it. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and support me on Patreon if you can, and all of that other good stuff. If you're already a Patreon supporter, go ahead and leave a comment there and let me know which video you'd like to see next, either the Tamron versus Sigma or the Sigma versus Canon.